Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, the European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and its consequences for the international tolling industry. I'm René Moser, Senior EU and International Affairs Manager at ASFINAG, the Austrian highway operator. Since July, I have also the pleasure and privilege to serve as International Vice President of IBTTA. For those of you who are not familiar with IBTTA or its international committee, I would like to give you a brief overview. IBTTA is the global organization of the owners and operators of toll facilities and the businesses that serve them. One of IBTTA's priorities is to provide a platform for sharing knowledge and expertise on the range of relevant topics affecting the operations and governance of the worldwide tolling industry. The IBTTA International Committee works to keep and maintain the link with IBTTA members from all over the globe. From that perspective, the International Committee is presenting a series of webinars to encourage members to share information on a variety of topics. Today, we are speaking about a very relevant issue for our industry, namely data protection. Our industry is serving millions of customers every day, generating and handling a huge amount of data. We are committed to do this carefully and in line with existing regulations. Today, we will get some great insights about the European General Data Protection Regulation and its effects on our industry, as well as about data protection at Florida's Turnpike Enterprise. Before I turn the webinar over to Samuel and our expert panelists, I would like to go over some logistics for this Zoom webinar. This webinar will last 75 minutes. There will be 5 presenters. All participants are in listen and view only mode. We encourage you to ask questions via the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Please address your questions to all panelists and attendees. We will be answering questions at the end of all presentations. We are also recording this webinar and it will be posted on the IBTTA website. I am now very pleased to introduce our moderator, Samuel Johnson. Samuel is IBTTA's president and the CEO of the Transportation Corridor Agencies in Orange County, California, and also immediate chair of the California Toll Operators Committee, whose 13 member agencies have been focusing on multi-statewide interoperability, customer communications, and legislative efforts to support privacy. Finally, I want to thank all of our international speakers. Thank you very much for their willingness to share their expertise with us. And I want to thank the whole IBTTA team for their great support in putting together today's webinar. I'm truly looking forward to meeting all of you in person again soon. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy this exciting webinar. So let's get started. Samuel, the floor is yours.
Samuel, it looks like we have you muted.
Thank you very much, Renee. Mr. Vice President, I am very pleased to moderate this session dedicated to GDPR. This subject is a topic that our IBTA Board of Directors and all our member agencies, especially those of us in the United States with evolving privacy legislation, wanted to discuss and hear from our international members so that we could better understand the implications of privacy regulations and the effects on the worldwide tolling industry. We will start today with a very special speaker. We're so pleased to welcome Dr. Ralph Sauer. Dr. Sauer is a deputy head of DG Justice and Consumers Unit for the International Data Flows and Protection at the European Commission, which covers data flows for commercial purposes and in the area of law enforcement cooperation. So with that, I'll hand it off to Ralph. So thank you, Ralph, if you want to take it from here.
Mute. So I already forgot the unmuting. First of all, welcome also from my side, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. And I'm very happy to join you today to say a few words about our new, well, now 2 years old, new legal framework for data protection that we have introduced in the European Union. We have actually two laws on data protection now. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and then we have a specific data protection law for the area of criminal law enforcement, that is the Law Enforcement Directive. But I will only focus on the GDPR, which is the one relevant for companies. And the GDPR, which entered into force in May 2016, and then had a 2-year transition period, so entered into application in May 2018, had quite a long inception period. We had about 7 years of discussions and work on the new law, and it was a difficult process with a lot of stakeholder involvement, a lot of lobbying, but I would say with a fair and balanced outcome. At least that's what I would think. And why did we introduce a new framework for data protection? We had already in the European Union data protection rules for quite some time in our member states, but also at union level with our data protection directive from 1995. But of course, a lot of things changed since 1995. We had tremendous technological developments. When you would have talked about the cloud in 1995, it would have meant rain, but not something to store data in. And we had, of course, a equally incredible development in terms of globalization and therefore data flows across borders, which also needed to be reflected in the data protection rules. And what we also had is, and that had to do with the nature of the data protection directive as a framework law, we had a lot of fragmentation of the legislative framework across the European Union with different transpositions in the member states. And that is, of course, not good for business. It's not good for intra-EU data flows. And so the intention was also to create a true internal market with an overarching data protection framework. And last but not least, we had a change in our treaties, including at the level of fundamental rights, namely the introduction of the Fundamental Rights Charter into the EU legal framework. And with that, data protection became a fundamental right in the European Union. So that was also an important reason to think about data protection once again. So what are the, next slide, yeah. So what are the main objectives and major changes? I would say one can break them down to, let's say, 3 core elements: a harmonized and simplified framework, an updated set of rights and obligations, and a modern data protection governance. And I will go through this one by one. Next slide. So first of all, the GDPR creates a harmonized and simplified legal framework. I already mentioned it creates one single set of data protection rules for the entire European Union. It has now a different nature. It's a regulation, which in EU legal terms means a law which is directly applicable in the member states rather than a framework law as we had before. And there is, and that's equally important, one interlocutor and one interpretation that is ensured, because of course it doesn't make sense if you would only have a uniform law, but then a very different application and interpretation. And that's why the GDPR creates the so-called one-stop shop. So a mechanism whereby companies only have to deal with one data protection authority, and then a so-called consistency mechanism, which ensures that in case of different views as to the interpretation and application of data protection law, there is a possibility to trigger a decision from what is called the European Data Protection Board, which is then binding on all the data protection authorities, and that ensures the a uniform and consistent interpretation application. We have also new rules on the territorial scope of application of the GDPR, which in certain circumstances can apply to foreign operators when they process data in a way that has a particular link to the European single market. And that's important to ensure a level playing field for all those companies and operators that compete for EU customers. And last but not least, the GDPR cuts a lot of red tape by abolishing systems of prior notification or authorization that existed previously, and also as regards international data transfers. Secondly, next slide, the GDPR introduces an updated set of rights and obligations. Important to note that this is evolutionary rather than revolutionary, meaning that the basic architecture is preserved and the core principles, obligations, and rights are maintained, but there are some changes that have to do, first of all, with putting individuals in better control of their data, for example, by stricter requirements for consent, but also new requirements for transparency, so the information given to individuals about the processing of their data, by introducing very limited but still important new rights, modern rights, for example, the right to data portability, and new obligations, for example, obligations to notify supervisory authorities and in certain cases also individuals of security incidents, what we call data breaches. But important to note that at the same time, a number of these obligations are graduated, so they're not one size fits all, but they differ in relation to the nature and potential risks of the processing operations, what we call the risk-based approach. That's, for example, true for data breach notification, but also for the requirement to appoint a data protection officer or to carry out a data protection impact assessment. And finally, next slide, the GDPR introduces a modern governance system, and I have already touched upon this. It clarifies the powers of the supervisory authorities. It clarifies the means in terms of resources and so forth that supervisory authorities need to have, and it equips them with better tools for cooperation. For example, possibility to carry out joint investigations. There's a new decision-making process that I already referred to, the one-stop shop and consistency mechanism. And all of this is linked to a new legal entity, the European Data Protection Board, which is not by itself a data protection authority, but it is a legal entity that brings together the data protection authorities from the member states for discussion and dispute settlement. And last but not least, the GDPR introduces a sanctioning regime which didn't exist under the old rules. You might have heard of the percentages. It can go up to 4% of global turnover. But of course, important to note that this is for the most serious or egregious violations. There's a much more graduated system and actually a list of factors that data protection authorities can and should take into account when assessing the actual level of a sanction, and therefore in the actual practice, as the last 2 years have shown, fines are much lower. But nevertheless, they are there as an important deterrent. So this will be my brief overview of the main objectives and major changes that the GDPR brought about. Perhaps just a very brief overview of what the GDPR contains. And you can see this on the slide. There's a set of core principles which are not very different from what we had previously. Things, for example, like data minimization, the requirement to stick to a certain purpose, the purpose of collection, or a compatible purpose. It's called purpose limitation, or limited data retention. Those are some of the core principles that might also concern you. The GDPR contains a number of obligations, to be noted, perhaps the transparency obligation, so to provide certain information to individuals, and data security, and linked to that, the requirement for data breach notification in case a security incident has occurred. It sets out a number of individual rights, and those are the classical rights of access to data, the right to request and obtain rectification of incorrect data, the right to erasure, in particular in case of unlawful processing, but also modern rights. I mentioned the right to data portability, and there's also a right with respect to automated decision-making, so decision-making through algorithms. And linked to that, there's a provision on the limitations. That's also important to note. These rights are not absolute, but they allow for a balance of interest, and so for important grounds of public interest, for example, these rights can be limited in a proportionate way. There are then also a couple of what we call accountability tools, so instruments that are there to ensure that operators, that companies actually comply with their requirements, with their obligations. The data protection officer is one of these, let's say, institutional tools. Data protection impact assessment is also a procedural tool to ensure compliance, and there are a few others. And then maybe to mention two more aspects of the GDPR, there is a specific provision on outsourcing of services that involves data processing. So the relationship between what we call the controller and a processor. And then there's a chapter on international data transfers that seeks to ensure that there is a certain continuity of protection when data leaves the European Union and goes to a third country. And it provides for a number of instruments and tools to transfer data, but with appropriate protections. Perhaps the last point, this is not an isolated EU approach. One sometimes has the impression that the GDPR is sort of perceived as an outlier, as something which is very European specific. We don't think so, and it's not what we see in our daily work. We see instead a lot of convergence around the globe towards the elements of a modern data protection regime, which I would say includes a comprehensive law which is cross-sectoral, that has these core principles, rights and obligations, and is backed up by oversight through an independent data protection authority. And that is something which you find now in many parts of the world. There are also regional models that are developing, not just the GDPR for let's say for Europe as a region, but also in Latin America, where the so-called Ibero-American data protection standards have been developed, very similar to GDPR standards, or in Africa, the so-called Malabo Convention, the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. And finally, there's a multilateral data protection treaty that is hosted by the Council of Europe, but is not limited to members of the Council of Europe. And that is Convention 108, which has by now, I believe, 55 state parties. And it's a very important instrument because it's also accompanied by a convention committee which develops standards and best practices. And just since we have a US audience, the US is an observer to that convention, but it has so far not made the decision to join that convention. I could stop here and maybe later on say a few words on the implementation and lessons learned, or say a few words about this now. I'm looking to our moderator just to give me a sign whether I should cover this still.
How about we maybe address that later on, Ralph?
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I would then finish on that note, and perhaps later on can say a few words how the GDPR has played out in the first 2 years of its application. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ralph. You know, the EU has clearly accomplished a lot with establishing data flows and protecting privacy of consumers. As the United States continues its path towards, you know, tolling interoperability on a national level, while individual states within the US are evolving their regulations around privacy, is there any advice you would offer us here in the US?
Well, I think in many ways, I would think that this stage of development is one that we have also seen in the European Union. We also have not states, but member states of the European Union, and data protection was originally developed at national level. And like in the US right now, it can create friction to have these local laws with different standards. I think it's already complicated enough at a global level, but of course, if you can avoid it for your internal market, I think it's important to create a harmonized set of rules, which should not be, maybe to say that also, not be the lowest common denominator.
Mm-hmm.
I think data protection in today's world is more and more seen as an element, an important element of trust. And therefore also an important element of creating a competitive advantage for companies. So one should not see it as a negative thing. And therefore, I would hope that, let's say, the states in the United States that have the best data protection laws at the moment should sort of be the example. And then, of course, it's important to not stop there. I think a harmonized set of rules is important, but it's also important to have foreseeable but good enforcement through an authority that can intervene, that has the tools to intervene. I think that's also maybe perhaps a question at the moment, whether these tools are there, for example, for the Federal Trade Commission, which is the privacy enforcer at the moment, but which has very limited powers. I think it's important also for those companies that do take their responsibilities for the protection of privacy seriously, and you can only create a level playing field between those and let's say the black sheep if there is a credible enforcement. So that's, I think, also an important element. And of course, the closer, that's my last comment perhaps, the closer these rules and this, let's say, structure would be to the one that we have in the European Union, the better, I would say, because that will greatly facilitate the flow of data between our two economies. And I think that the transatlantic relationship remains one of the most important ones in terms of data flows. So I think we can only gain from a convergence of our rules. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much again, Ralph, for your time. We really appreciate it. We would definitely be honored if you can stick around for some more Q&A and to talk about the 2 years of implementation that you mentioned. But we do know you have a committed schedule, so we'll see if you can hang around and stay with us. So I'm very happy that we can continue our discussion with 4 of our industry experts who are very knowledgeable on this topic. So we have 4 panelists, the first of which is Pascal Lemonnier, the Executive Director of Business Development at Aegis Projects. Pascal is an engineer who has developed projects for Aegis in the US and Canada, as well as Latin America. After Pascal, we will hear from Arnaud Hairy, CEO of Eurotoll. Armand has been working in the infrastructure sector for more than 25 years. He worked inter alia for Cofiroute, Sanef, and Sapan concessions, where he was in charge of contractual relationships with the concession grantor, as well as for promoting and negotiating all amendments to concession contracts. Arnaud was also chairman of the French Motorway Association, ASFA. In October 2019, Arnaud has been moving to Eurotoll SAS as the new CEO. Then we will hear from Juan Gomez Lobo. Juan is the Tolls Data Center Director at the Florida Turnpike Enterprise. Juan has over 20 years of experience in multidisciplinary projects in a variety of industries, 10 of those in the tolling and transportation industry. Before joining Florida's Turnpike, Juan was the Chief Information Officer at Indiana Toll Road Concession Company, in charge of developing and implementing the technology strategy, revamping the business end-to-end technology infrastructure, including the operational and commercial back office. And then our final speaker is my good friend, Mr. John Davis, the Commercial Director of Toll Plus Europe, Ltd. John is a European Union General Data Protection Regulation Compliance expert and has completed preparedness commissions with Ireland's National Transport Authority and the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport. So I am now delighted to welcome today's panel of experts who will provide some international perspectives and insights. So with that, our first presenter, Pascal, if you can please take yourself off mute, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Samuel. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Pascal Lemonnier, and I am in charge of the business development in Aegis. I'm going to talk to you today about the way we have implemented the GDPR processes in our company. So from the introduction of GDPR, Aegis has managed all and have to adapt all its organization. And we have also to change or to adapt our IT system in order to manage the data processing and the new rules that have been put that have been to comply with the GDPR. So we modify our internal process and we nominate a DPO in order to manage the data management inside our organization, but only inside of our organization, but also for our client. GDPR processes have been implemented in Aegis from 2018, so we have now 2 years experience on the way to manage this new regulation. So as I said, we had to integrate GDPR for 2 purposes. The first one is for our internal database, for the employees, for the contact centers, for the client, or the contact of the clients that we have and we manage inside our organization. And secondly, we had to comply with new European tender specification in the proposal that we have to manage for public and private entities. The entity that is supervising the compliance of GDPR in France is named CNIL. CNIL, if I translate it in English, it will be National Committee for Data, Computer and Freedom. And they are involved in all data management projects, and you need to be certified by CNIL if you would like to implement a new data management project for your client. Next slide. So if I take the example, for example, so just to remind you what we have to do from the beginning when we decided to implement the GDPR. So GDPR concerns all Aegis Group company. We have more or less 60 to 70 subsidiaries, and we have to be sure that all the subsidiaries is going to comply with the same rules and same processes. So the DPOs got data management contact that are in all subsidiaries. They are in charge to verify that the compliance of these rules. So for an easy identification, we first had to create a mapping of the concerned data. We have to split the non-sensitive personal data and the sensitive personal data and to manage it in a way to comply with the new regulation. The protection of personal data consists above all in making sure that the trade process do only use adequate and strictly necessary data. That means that when you store data in your database, you have to be sure that there is a process behind this, and the data you are going to use is only used for the purpose of this process only, which is important. So each data you get in your database, you have to be sure about this. And as well, if I take an example, for example, of the contact data, inside our organizations, we manage the contact of our client, of our partners, in order to send them some commercial information, in order to take appointment with our client, or to find new partners. So when we had to implement the GDPR regulation, we had first to identify all the contact database in all the organization, in all the subsidiaries of Aegis, which wasn't easy, but so we do it. At least we concentrate in Europe because it's concerning mainly Europe or only Europe. And doing that, so we have to have a complete list about all the data or contact data that we have. So in the data, we have the name of the people, the first name, second name, we have also the phone number, the email address, and so on. All these data are considered as personal data. And as soon as we have done that, we had to send a message to them, each of them, in order to ask the authorization, first of all, to get this data and to keep it in our database. And secondly, we ask them for the purpose. Can I send you commercial information? Can I send you email? And can I contact you in case I need to set an appointment with you? All that have been done, automatically. So we have developed a process in order to do it. And each response has been analyzed. And for those that are rejected our authorization, let's say, we had to cancel all the personal data of this person inside our database. So this process took at least 1 year. Time to collect the data, time to send the email, time to get the analysis, time to clean the data as well. And so it takes a lot of time, but now it's done. And we have to each year to refresh that, but it's now a complete automatic process, which enables us to keep, first of all, a very clean database, because with that we can also check when somebody is changing the company or changing his address email or whatever. And we also be sure that we comply completely with the regulation of GDPR. So this is what we have done internally for our internal data. Secondly, we had also to secure completely all our IT systems. So we put new firewall, we put new antivirus to be sure that the data cannot be hacked from outside. And this is also, we have some stress tests as well in order to be sure that all the data that we keep inside our database is very, very secured. Next slide, please. So the second point is how we have to comply with GDPR when for our clients. So we have to submit proposal, and we have to prove in our proposal that we comply with GDPR processes. So first, we have developed what we name a security and privacy by design. That means that the GDPR, the security and protection of personal data are integrated in the design phase. And secondly, we have to pass the certification ISO 27001, which is Information System Security, that we use as a guidance. And in all our current projects, so we test and pass this certification. So it was the case for the project that we have in Ireland, because in these two projects, for example, we are managing personal data. It was the same in UK, and it was the same in Netherlands, it was the same in France. So it took some time in our current project to pass this ISO 27001, but now it's almost necessary, obligatory, let's say, to prove that you've got this certification, or at least that you follow the processes of this certification. And we have developed as well, which is very important to have in mind, that data location and cloud provider that you use is very important, because if you manage data from US or data from Europe or European data, you have to be sure that the data are stored in Europe and not externally at Europe, or in a country where the process are the same than in Europe. Next slide, please. And to finish my presentation, I would like just also to give you an example. In Europe, vehicle license plate is considered as a personal data. So each time you need to manage traffic data, you would like to make a traffic analysis in the city, or you would like to have you collection the license plates in order to do enforcement for on-street parking, for example. So you need to follow a very strict rules. You need to first to encrypt the data that you collect. You cannot store the data for a very long time. It's very short time. And that means that when you have to do some statistics, you have to be sure that you comply with all the data. So all these applications, as I show you in this slide, for mobile speed enforcement, on-street parking enforcement, free for electronic tolling, mobility services, should comply with data protection and should comply with the GDPR. So it means that you need to prove that in your IT and your informatics system, you are completely protected and secure against any hacking possibilities, and that the personal data that you keep inside your database, the license plate, for example, you cannot keep it for a long time, or you have to keep it for a dedicated purpose, or as the authorization of the owner of the vehicle, which quite complicated, and maybe especially when you would like to proceed with traffic analysis in a road, just to know who is commuting, who is not commuting, and how the traffic is evolving during the day. So I believe my time is done now. So I thank you very much to listen, and I'm very happy to answer to all your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Pascal. There are a few questions that we'll get to at the end, but if you want to take a look at the chat, so I think the audience has already asked you a couple that hopefully we'll have time to respond to. So our next presenter is Arnaud Harry. Arnaud, please take yourself off mute. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Samuel, and happy to be there today. I will talk about the GDPR from a toll service provider. So next slide, please. I'm talking as a EATS provider. What is an EATS provider? In the context, we are working in a context of cross-European journey for a truck company. So a truck company needs to drive across European countries, need to address different kind of toll system. France, Germany, Portugal, Spain have different toll systems, and they need to be sure that they will pay the proper level of tolls and with the proper tools. So we are there to provide these tools, we are there to provide these services, and this is what an EATS provider is for in Europe. So we do make the toll interoperability simple for trucks company and only trucks company. That's important in a GDPR context. So as I'm stating in this presentation, we are compliant, of course, and Pascal just explained us the process, the long process of being compliant in terms of data, since we are collecting data. But the subject is our business is 100% data. We are 100% data dependent. It means that we transform the toll data coming from toll chargers, if not concessionaires or toll agencies, into invoices for our customers, including all the relevant details about who, license plate, drove where and when, trips reporting. And these data are requested by the clients, the trucks company. So in even some countries, we have geolocation points. So it means we can really track all the drivers' behaviors. And this is per se data and personal data to be protected. So we act as data controller. Our processes have been mapped and redesigned if necessary to be sure that data is protected and data is used in an accurate way, as Pascal stated. But we are under the pressure of our clients. It means that our clients are indeed, they want us to use their data. They require smart reporting. When I'm saying smart reporting, it means that they would not be happy if we just say at the end of the month, so company having 10 trucks, you us 1,000 euro. They say, okay, but can you split it by truck? Okay, we can split it by truck. Could you split it by country, by time, by day? I don't know. So indeed, at the end of the day, they need to have this detailed information. So they want us to use their data to make their smart reporting. And indeed, they want also to have alerts on their consumptions. For example, they want to be sure that the proper trucks is running on the proper journey and not exchanging or mismatch or errors or frauds. So it means that if we were only dealing with anonymous data or encrypted data, we will not be able to perform the service our clients are wanting to. And indeed, from our point of view, we are keen to use data too. It means that in some cases, we know that we have geolocation points for toll purpose, but we could use it as telematic services in order to upsell the services we provide to our clients. And so it means that from our side as well, we are voluntary data hunters or data processors. So it means that indeed we need to be sure that it is done accordingly to the rules and according to the yes to the willingness and the clear willingness of the clients. But at Eurotoll, we are happy because we have only one set of clients. It is B2B, not B2C, so it's easier, and we have only voluntary clients. I mean by this that we are not having by default clients like for example in the examples provided by Pascal, if you want to deal with the traffic management systems, things like this. Here only the clients that has provided to us are their info are our clients. So it helps, of course, to ease the process, but nevertheless, we still have to comply with the rules. So next slide, please. So main challenges. Main challenges are clearly archive and data retention period. We know that first we have legal requirements. We have to keep all the invoices we have received, or all the invoices we have processed during a certain period of time due to fiscal laws in France, but also in different European countries. So this is the first set of legal requirements. Then you have the commercial needs. Some clients say, okay, remember last year, what could you provide me the statistics or the details for last year? Okay, so we need to have this retention period as well, and GDPR principles. So GDPR principles means, of course, it has to be accessible, to have rectification rights and portability, as Ralph stated. It means that for this archive and data retention period, the automated cleaning processes has to be implemented. And this is the hard part of the business, because you are keen to work and to be safe and to be clean on the data collection and the usage of the data. Then the data is considered to be dead in the terms that you don't use it, but it's still there. So in terms of business, it's dead. In terms of GDPR, it's still alive. So don't forget, GDPR is overseeing the business aspects of the data. If data is there, data is alive. And then last but not least, the other challenge, but it is not that much a challenge. It's better, let's say, a way of doing this is privacy by design, privacy by default. It is the best way to deal with our different tools, the way with the data. It means, of course, you have to have the new tools for it is easier to do it with the new developments is easier, but still privacy by design, privacy by default. So if you don't need the info, don't take the info, because you will be handling a lot of problem if you take an info you don't need. So these are the main challenges. And the last one that is not on the screen but should not be forgotten is the increasing tendency for getting GNSS, so it means geolocation. So it's a geolocation usage of the toll data. And this comes as well with the social guidelines for the truck drivers. You may know that in Europe, we are also having this GDPR regulation, but we'll also have what we say the social package for the trucks driver to uniformize the guidelines across Europe. And this includes elements that normally goes in a separate digital tachograph. So data for this is recorded separately. But as the company wants to have, the companies we are dealing with want to have the same info, they want to have the replication of this info coming from the geolocation devices implemented for toll services. And it means that we have increasing pressure for this to enter in a very touchy additional information, because we go in the, let's say, specific behavior of each driver. How long did you drive? Where did you park? Did you leave the truck when parking? Because there is some regulation this as well. So this kind of info are really now the detailed info you have to handle. So to sell the process, to sell the service, you have to have the info. But if you don't sell the service, you should erase the info. So where to start, where to stop, this is one of the main challenges, but I'm sure it is shared by a lot of players or around the computer today. And I'm happy to answer about this. I don't want to use too much of my time. So here where I stop. Samuel, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Arnaud. So our next presenter is Juan Gomez Lobo. Juan, you have the floor. If you can take yourself off mute.
Thank you, Samuel, and very happy to be here. And good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everybody that is joining this discussion. I wanted to touch during this time a little bit more on the tolling industry and really the comparison and the approaches from in the U.S. Compared to the European Union. I thought a good idea to show this map so you guys can see the colorful landscape we have here in the US, right? But it also really outlines the level of complexity that we have in the market today in the US, and Rolf alluded to that. So the level of complexity we have here is way higher in terms of the standards, in terms of protocols that we use, in terms of strategies around cash collection or even customer data collection, and the different business rules each agency decides to implement. In the US compared to the European Union, as you've heard before, contrary to the European Union approach to have a government-led legislation around data security, in the US, although there are legislation at a state level, data security is mainly driven by the market itself, being the word that everybody knows, the PCI framework, the main driver today. But as we all know, PCI doesn't necessarily cover all the aspects of data security and privacy that Ralph mentioned earlier. The different tolling facilities as well, adding to this complexity, are a different stage of the technology life cycle, right? There are a multitude of agencies in the midst of a significant back office upgrade projects in the next 1 to 3 years. And each agency is taking the opportunity during those life cycles to incorporate stronger policies around data security and data privacy. As Samuel mentioned just earlier, right, we are in the midst of that transition into national interoperability. We're still not there, but that potentially will help eventually in simplifying the landscape and allowing us to have a more standardized approach to data management across the industry. And the other thing I wanted to outline here before we move to the next slide is that even with that map, we still see discrepancies or differences in the level of scrutiny, depending on whether it's a public agency running a facility or if it is a private operator. The public facilities are usually subject to a more in-depth scrutiny and oversight where the private sector has more quote unquote freedom on how they manage their business rules and their data. Moving to this slide, as we see in this map, I took the liberty of showing the information published by the International Association of Privacy Professionals, just showing that is not only in the tolling industry or differences between the US and the European Union in general. I'm sorry, can you move back in the presentation? You can see that within the states, there are different approaches to data security and different levels of adoption to the data privacy and data security. As Ralph alluded earlier, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is our enforcement power arm at the federal level from a data security and privacy perspective. But the reality is that currently there are really no significant legislature at a federal level, and it's mainly driven at the state level today. And with those discrepancies on the level of adoption per state, being California today the leading edge on data privacy and security standards. So I'm sure the rest of the country will transition gradually into that. But just to show the different differences between the states today that add a lot to that complexity as to how we standardize across the country. If you can move to the next slide. Here, talking a little more of the challenges of the tolling industry itself from our data security. I already mentioned, and Samuel alluded to national interoperability. The industry is transitioning to strengthening and lowering the footprint in terms of data collection, right, with tokenization of credit card or payment information and initiatives like that. But at the same time, we have a lot of challenges as an industry that we haven't really addressed yet, or they're not at the mature level that, for example, in Europe, it is addressed today. So we see here, right, it is increasing the availability of smartphone applications in the market, an increased approach from agencies to move to a third-party service provider instead of an in-house hosted systems. There's an increase in cloud-based operations. Also, quite a significant penetration on IoT devices and sensors across the different infrastructures, capturing customer data or vehicle information, as it was mentioned before. And right now in the US, there's really no framework or maturity around how the data collected through all these systems, connected vehicles, technology, et cetera, are being managed, stored, and processed in a secure way. So it's more led to the local level or the agency level today on how to apply or translate those security requirements into what we do. If you can move to the next slide. And just going a little more in detail, I just wanted to show what we do in Florida. The Florida Turnpike, in particular, in the SunPass system, we take data privacy as a top priority in the projects that we address as part of our technology lifecycle. But we as a public agency obviously are governed by the Florida state statutes and US privacy laws. But again, being PCI and NIST are major building blocks around the security built on our systems. And just to outline some of the statutes today available in Florida that we need to make sure we adhere to. In our case, we are transitioning to a opt-in, opt-out type of approach to different services when customers want to sign in, but definitely not at the level that GDPR brings to the table today. And that was really the presentation of the information I wanted to present to the group here as to how the different facilities, estates, and tolling operators address the challenges around data management today in this industry.
All right, thank you very much, Juan. Our final presenter is John Davis. John, please take yourself off mute and you have the floor.
Thank you, Samuel. Good afternoon or good morning, good day to everybody. And as the last speaker, I have the advantage of being able to skip over bits of my presentation that have already been covered. So hopefully I'll try and be a little bit quick. Next slide, please. So I suppose within the EU, the GDPR stipulates how organizations must comply with the data privacy principles. And as Ralph said earlier, these principles are not new, but they have been significantly strengthened by the GDPR. During the 2-year lead-in period, most organizations went through the grief cycle process, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. But I think it was interesting that acceptors who implemented the right processes have identified significant benefits that they didn't realize they were going to attain at the time. Next slide, please. Complying with the GDPR required a forensic review of existing operations across all business units. An example of the process there's on this screen is a process implemented by the Irish National Transport Authority. They have responsibility for a number of public transport functions, some of it regulations, some of it operations, like say they operate the integrated ticketing scheme, the National Journey Planner, rural transport schemes, that sort of thing. And they basically developed a management system that set up a data ecosystem. We went through each of their business units and we undertook a data mapping process, which was developing a detailed data inventory and process flows, and then initiating a data privacy impact assessment, which is basically applying a risk analysis on the processing of that data. And this was done at individual business level, but it was also centralized at the top central organizational level, I suppose. In tandem with all of this, various policies and procedures had to be updated, privacy statements, data retention policies, and again at an organizational level and at an application or business unit level. There was also the European Commission, and in Ireland's case, the Irish Data Protection Office were also extremely supportive through this process in terms of giving advice, and I think, as Ralph mentioned earlier, harmonisation. For example, at the European Data Protection Board level, they gave guidance on developing standard contractual clauses that you can include in all your contracts with data processors, people, third parties you share data with, etc. Next slide, please. Some of the lessons learned, I suppose GDPR does not hinder operational processes, nor does it prevent implementation of policy objectives. You can still do what you need to do or what your business wants to do. You just have to make sure you take the right steps. The adage, fail to prepare, prepare to fail, definitely applies with GDPR. There's a lot of effort involved in getting everything set up, but once you invest in that effort, then it's pretty much plain sailing after that. Proportionality is important, but not to be used as an excuse. The GDPR includes the concept of proportionality, like you don't have to go to the nth degree necessarily to comply with a GDPR clause, but you just have to be able to demonstrate that the steps you have taken are proportional. What is vital is ensuring collective responsibility across all levels of the organization. I think, as Arnaud said earlier, the biggest overhead is actually in implementing the data retention policies. It's when you start to look at all your legacy data, it's stuff that you've parked in files and physical paper that you've got in filing cabinets in the office somewhere that you forgot about. And attention to detail really matters, because small breaches have occurred due to like leaving papers behind in the office or public places, sending unencrypted email attachments to the wrong person. It's the small things that trip you up. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, preparation incurred overhead but yielded many benefits. There were the compliance benefits. Obviously, you want to avoid the monetary impact of data protection breaches, and the reputational impact, loss of trust, impact on share price. I think in the UK, Carphone Warehouse had suffered a data breach a couple of years ago, and their share price dropped by over 10% overnight. And it also minimizes the risk of business continuity impacts. If you have a data breach or a data audit ongoing in your business, it can be quite disruptive. So having the right procedures in place helps mitigate that. There were consequential benefits. There was the opportunity to declutter, get rid of legacy data, but also old ideas and bad habits. As people were looking at their process flows, they started to ask themselves, well, why are we actually doing it that way? Just because we always did, you know. And it was an opportunity to streamline systems and operations. There were also a lot of future-proofing benefits. It's going through the preparation process was a strong foundation for compliance with additional upcoming regulations. Recently in the EU, we had the 5th anti-money laundering legislation came into force, which compels businesses to apply two-factor authentication for security purposes. But we also have upcoming a new e-privacy directive, which deals with machine-to-machine communications. And as part of that, you have to be conscious of safeguarding the privacy of personal data that's held in the metadata of those communications. More importantly for me, putting this in place, or the preparation in place, was a strong foundation for the operational impact of digitalization. You gain an enriched understanding of your data and how you use it throughout the organization. Next slide, please. As we've already, our previous speakers have discussed, there is slightly different approaches within the EU and the US. I think in the US, the focus has been more on security, but as Juan says, that does not cover all the data privacy principles. Next slide. But when we ask ourselves why data privacy matters, I think providing customers with choices in how much PII is divulged is proven as helping to build trust and increase public acceptance and compliance levels. However, obviously providing choices can impact operational efficiency. We saw with the Oregon Origo road user pilot, road user charging pilot, which is now a system or an application. They offered multiple choices. There was a choice of different technologies, a choice of a public or private sector provided account, choice of assessment technology. Did you want mileage only or GPS tracking? And then there was optional access to value-added services such as insurance, gamification, vehicle diagnostics, etc. I think if they hadn't have offered those choices, the program wouldn't have been as successful as it was. You compare that against, say, the London congestion charging scheme, that just utilizes ANPR technology and provides no choices to customers. Transport for London did consider moving to more cost-efficient technologies, such as using ANPR or DSRC, But the proliferation of CCTV and ANPR in the UK means that drivers are used to that technology and trust TfL to safeguard their data. So I suppose gaining customer trust is dependent on a balanced combination of the newness of the scheme, familiarity with the technology, faith in the organization and the service levels provided. But I suppose in our industry, the rapid pace of digitalization is leading to a lot of newness. Therefore, data privacy matters more than ever. Next slide, please. So in summary, if we look at our sector, we've shifted from being infrastructure-centric to user-centric. Increased digitalization is leading to the need to process ever-increasing volumes of personal data. The EU plans additional data privacy regulations, whilst US states are likely to follow California's lead, as we've already discussed. So starting preparation now is a good move. But proper preparation is a foundation for compliance and improved operations, improved service provision, and future-proofing for increased digitalization. So my recommendation is that it's now time to activate the Act Now button across the board. Next slide. And my closing quote from Warren Buffett: only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. Are you sure you're all wearing your bathing costumes? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, JD. And thanks again to all the presenters for the great information you shared. And I think now we have some time to address questions. I see some have been submitted through the chat function, and I would encourage all the participants to submit your questions there so we can respond to them either verbally or as some of the panelists have already done directly within the chat feature. So there were a couple other questions we received that I'll ask the panel, and maybe each of you can take a moment to respond. And I'm happy to see that Ralph is still able to participate. So I would say, what do you view as being the #1 enabler for GDPR implementation at the EU, member state, and organization levels? Anyone want to take a shot at that one?
Hi, Samuel. My view is it's buy-in, but also being driven from the top down. At EU level, it was a European regulation, so everybody, all member states had to take action. At say national level, it was the same thing. The Data Protection Commissioner put the processes in place, but I suppose more at an organizational level, and if I look at the organizations that have been, say, best practice in this area, it was driven from the board and CEO level down. Like, say, the example of the National Transport Authority that I used. The project team was led by the Chief Technical Officer and reporting directly to the CEO and the board on a regular basis, and that cascaded down to all the business units. And yeah, everybody has a busy day job and conflicting priorities, but when you have that level of buy-in from the top down, it helps get organizational wide buy-in.
Absolutely agree. And I think that organizational commitment to privacy is extremely important, and it needs to be there. Others, what's kind of made GDPR successful? I think those of us outside the EU view what you guys have accomplished as very significant. So are there some key things you would attribute to that success?
First, perhaps clear clear guidelines and stable guidelines and not revolutionary guidelines. I mean, it was in the continuity of the process already implemented in many countries. At least I talk from France. It means it was a natural evolution and it is still business oriented. So far, I haven't heard I cannot do this business because of GDPR. Not yet. Perhaps once, but not yet.
All right. No, that's good information. And I know it kind of points to something that Ralph mentioned during his presentation, and maybe he can talk about, one of the things, being a California resident, our agency operating here in California, as was noted by a couple of the presenters, we are very much, I guess, at the head of the charge around consumer privacy and protecting data. And our tolling operations and industry within California has always been strongly regulated by privacy. But I think in some of the discussions, we lose track of the purpose aspect, right? The purpose and the, that we need the data for and how we're using it. So trying to find that balance is important. So Ralph, it looked like you were going to share some thoughts.
You see, first of all, am I? Okay, so I mean, of course, I mean, privacy is at least in Europe, but maybe also in certain state constitutions protected as a human right or as a fundamental right. But it's not an absolute right. So indeed, it allows for a balancing with other interests to some extent. The GDPR makes that very clear that for a number of its provisions, you can have limitations or restrictions to the extent this is done for important public interest, for example, and it's done in a proportionate manner. So certainly data protection rules should allow for this, and they should be workable and practicable. So that's certainly true. At the same time, I think I'm quite encouraged actually by what I've heard from a number of speakers that this seems to be workable and it actually presents benefits to companies. It's especially what Angela Brady said towards the end. I fully share, and it's also what we hear from a number of other companies and other sectors that there are clear benefits, that there are certain upfront costs probably if you at least come from a time where maybe you didn't have any data protection rules in place, although this is very often not the case. I think we are rather talking about updating maybe your systems, but even that probably involves certain costs. But if you implement this into your organization, into your procedures, and ultimately into your data management system, then very likely you will not have ongoing costs or to a much more limited extent, and it will just become part of your normal operation, and even might help you to only use the data or keep the data that you need to. I mean, I think Angela Brady spoke about decluttering your system. That's also something which we hear quite often. So a lot of the stuff which at first sight, I mean, these privacy rules, which at first sight sound maybe overly demanding or complicated, turn out to be good management practices in the end, and can help you. I heard, on the other hand, a couple of things which I'm not entirely sure where they come from. I've heard a couple of times references to data localization, which is not something that the GDPR requires. I mean, you have to, of course, ensure a certain continuity of protection when data is transferred, and you have to ensure data security, but there's no localization requirement whatsoever. And maybe just to also on the data retention side, I think what our rules at least say is that the data retention is linked to the purpose. So as long as you have a legitimate purpose for the processing of the data, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the original purpose of collection, but it has to be a compatible purpose. As long as you have one of those, and that might cover even things like archiving, for example, you can retain the data. So the requirement is not that you should keep data only for as long as necessary, but for as long as necessary for the purpose that you're pursuing. And that, I mean, if you have no longer any purpose for the data, well, then indeed it makes no sense to keep them. Also because you just increase your risks in terms of data breaches, and that is something that's to be avoided, and plus the cluttering of your system. So, but it gives quite a bit of flexibility as to data retention, because compatible purposes are covered. And as I said, this might cover a number of things, including archiving or research also. Just to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see, Pascal, you saw the question that was asked, and thank you for your response for just differences in terminology. So when you say, I'm sorry, to the panel or to the attendees, there was a question asked regarding what are the penalties for not complying with GDPR and how are they determined? And Pascal was providing a response to that. Is just a follow-up on that response, Pascal. So 2 to 4% of the turnover of the company. In US terminology, is that total global revenue? What is that 2 to 4% calculated?
Yes, this is the revenue of the company, sorry. But total global revenue, I think Ralph can answer better the question to me than me, but it's what we have. Turnover is the revenue of the company.
Yes, it's the global turnover of the company indeed. But I think the more important point is perhaps that 2 and 4% are the maximum amounts. This is the ceiling. The ceiling that can the maximum amount that can be imposed on a company, but doesn't mean, of course, that fines are anywhere near there. There might be much lower, and very often data protection authorities do not fine at all, but rather take other measures which can reach from soft measures like warnings, recommendations to injunctions to in order to change processing operations, and then sanction is one let's say arrow in the arsenal. But very often I hear the fine is 4% or the fine is 10% or 2%. But no, those are the maximum amounts for the most egregious violations. And as I said, there's a list of factors in the GDPR, in the relevant article, that tells you that things like the type of data plays a role, the type of the infringement plays a role, whether it was negligent or intentional, whether it's a repeat offense, and so forth. So there's a number of factors. If you always have sort of the worst element, you're a repeat offender, you did it intentional, it concerns health data, well, you might be able to, you might reach the 4%, but that's not going to be applied in the normal scenario. So I think that's important to clarify.
Yeah, yes, you're right. Thank you very much, Ralph. It's up to, I forget to put up to, but completely agree. I think the GDPR regulation and the way it is managed in Europe is not necessary to put penalties to companies. It's really to try to push all the company to have right in mind that personal data is very important first, and that there is some rules to follow, and regulation can help in order to protect all personal data for everybody. And this is really the spirit of these rules, not to necessarily apply penalties as soon as you are not complying with 1 or 2 rules in the regulation. This is really the spirit of that.
That's definitely a lesson learned that the US can try and follow and try and, adhere to that. It's about the spirit of the intent and looking at, again, what Ralph mentioned earlier about the purpose of why you're using the data. when we talk about interoperability here in the States and national interoperability, that requires us to exchange data. And there are a lot of concerns around the data, or there have been some concerns expressed around that exchanging of data. And I think there's a lack of recognition around the intent and what we're trying to provide to customers and the purpose and use of that data. Other questions. So I know we've got a few of the panelists who work with companies who are providing these services on an international level. So as you're looking at, the GDPR and what applies in the EU versus what may apply in Canada versus what may apply in the US, how are you managing that within your companies and developing your systems? And perhaps even JD, I think you mentioned the concept of future proofing. So maybe the panelists can share some thoughts on what you're doing to address that.
I'll start off on that one, Samuel. I think it's a case of, well, in Toll Plus, we applied the GDPR principles and processes irrespective of where we operate, because I think we found it's good practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also quite important for the success of any sort of operation, like not just our systems, but also the client's operations that the systems support. And I think if we refer back to the previous conversation about the potential fines and everything, what costs more than the actual monetary fine is the reputational impact for an agency or for a business on having a breach. And that's becoming more and more important in this digital age, because customers want the services that we can provide, but they also want to feel that their personal data is safeguarded, like that they're not going to be ripped off or spammed, etc. So I think with Toll Plus, irrespective of where we actually operate in the world, we will apply similar processes because they're proven to work and they're proven as good practice.
That definitely aligns with the comment Ralph shared earlier in terms of the question, as those of us in the US at the federal level, or even, the existing model at the state level, if we can look to GDPR as a starting point to make sure we recognize our global economy, that sounds like a good practice, and it sounds like what the folks at Toll Plus are following. Hey, Juan, I know you got this question. Maybe you want to expand on it a little bit. So, I know this is a question that comes up in Florida, and it definitely comes up in California as well, considering that we have major tourist destinations in our state. So when we have an EU citizen traveling and using a toll facility in Florida, how do you address privacy?
Thanks, Samuel. And it's a good question. And the answer really is that there's no specific framework today defined around visitors and how we deal with the data. What we try to do is provide services to those customers where we provide the option of anonymity. So one of the things we do is offer a visitor profile space. I can hear a lot of it. What I was saying, I offer a visitor profile that allows for cache reloads and not require any specific registration process. And we are also considering pushing out a preloaded transponder, pre-activated, so customers don't need to register if they so choose to. The fact today is that if customers want to open an account, they will be treated as locals, quote unquote, right? But the idea is to, in the meantime, we evolve as a country, right, into those standards. We can offer alternatives to customers to prevent or to allow them to not share their personal information with us and still enjoy the use of our facilities and our services.
I think that's a great approach, Juan, and thank you for sharing. I think that helps address not only the international aspect, but even for US citizens who maybe, we're not quite as mature around privacy expectations as some of our European counterparts. So having that flexibility in how customers choose to pay and what type of an account they have, I think that's a good thing all around. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I again want to thank our panel. Our time is running short, so let me offer my thanks again to Renee Moser, IBTTA International Vice President. Our expert presenters, thank you to all of you, and I know Arnaud had to drop off for an urgent matter. And thank you to our international committee for the great work you're doing, and also IBTTA staff, Kristen and Ansela, for pulling all this together and the great support you're providing the team. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our International Vice President, Mr. Renee Moser, to close out today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It was a great pleasure and honor for us to have you as IBTTA President with us and to moderate this session. Thanks also to all our panelists. Thanks to Ralph, Pascal, Anna, Juan, John. It was fantastic to learn a lot today, that you really were willing to share your experience with us. And yes, please don't forget to give us also a short feedback. You will receive a short survey. It would be great if you could share your thoughts about this webinar with us to further improve, because we will continue this series of webinars. And yes, please go to the IBTTA website, check out for the upcoming events. In the near future, all of them will be still virtual, but I really hope we can meet again in person soon. And thanks to all of you for being with us today, for spending your time with us. And I'm very much looking forward to our next meeting, virtual, in person. And please stay safe and healthy. That's the most important thing at the moment. And I'm very much looking forward to see you soon again. Thank you. Great afternoon, great evening. Thanks again, and see you soon.